At Dallas Airport, chaos erupts when tomb guard Marcus Reed escorts Sergeant Jason Crowley's flag-draped casket through the terminal, defying protocol. Supervisor Mallerie Stevens demands compliance, and a mocking crowd films the standoff. Marcus stands firm, honoring a fallen hero's final wish. Tensions peak until Colonel David Monroe's commanding presence silences the crowd, inspiring veterans to form a corridor of respect. The terminal transforms, honoring sacrifice over bureaucracy. But who issued the intercom call that shifted the tide? And what lasting change did this spark? Uncover the mystery of Terminal B's transformation in this gripping tale. Join us to honor heroes like Sergeant Crowley. Subscribe to my channel for inspiring stories of courage and sacrifice. Your support helps share tales that remind us to stand for honor. Hit that subscribe button and be part of our community, celebrating duty and respect. Thank you. The Dallas airport thrummed with the chaotic pulse of morning travel. A cacophony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and overlapping intercom announcements filled the terminal, where weary travelers clutched steaming coffee cups and shuffled toward their gates. Security officers, their faces etched with the strain of maintaining order, moved with clipped efficiency, scanning documents and directing the flow of passengers. Amid this restless tide, a sudden stillness rippled through Gate B7, as if the air itself had paused to take notice. A lone soldier, his dress uniform pristine to the point of reverence, led a solemn procession. With measured steps, he pushed a ceremonial cart bearing a flag-draped casket, its corners adorned with delicate white flowers. A small nameplate gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sergeant Jason Crowley, Private First Class. Marcus Reed, just 27, carried a weight far heavier than his years. His face, though youthful, was carved with the somber resolve of someone who had stared into the abyss of loss too many times. His uniform was a study in perfection, every crease knife-sharp, every button polished to a mirror's sheen. A silver tomb guard badge glinted on his chest, a quiet testament to his sacred duty. His white-gloved hands gripped the casket's handle with a steadiness that seemed to anchor him to the earth, as if letting go would unravel something essential within him. Marcus had volunteered for this mission, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, unspoken conviction. When Sergeant Crowley's family had pleaded for a tomb guard to escort their son on his final journey home, Marcus hadn't hesitated. To him, this was no mere assignment. It was a vow, a hallowed responsibility to honor a fallen brother. The weight of that promise pulsed in his chest with every step, grounding him even as the chaos of the airport swirled around him. But the civilian world operated on different rules, ones that cared little for sacred oaths. Mallerie Stevens, a 29-year-old airport supervisor with a clipboard clutched like a shield, strode forward to intercept the procession. Her efficiency was almost palpable, her movements sharp and authoritative, driven by a need to maintain control in the relentless churn of the terminal. "Stop right there," she commanded, her voice slicing through the din. "This is a restricted area. Coffins go through cargo handling, not the passenger terminal." Her tone was firm, unyielding, as if the matter were already settled. A burly security guard flanked her, his broad frame reinforcing her authority. "Airport protocol is clear," he barked. "Military processions can't disrupt civilian boarding procedures." The words landed like a gavel, and the surrounding travelers slowed, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding tension. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of intrigue and impatience. Some passengers fumbled for their phones, already recording what promised to be a dramatic confrontation. A businessman in a tailored suit, his face pinched with irritation, muttered under his breath, "Military show-off. Why not just use the back door like everyone else?" His words carried just far enough to sting, though Marcus gave no sign he'd heard. His gaze remained fixed forward, his expression an unreadable mask of discipline. Every fiber of his being was tethered to the casket, to the man it carried, to the family waiting for their son's return. He stood like a sentinel, unmoved by the growing restlessness around him. Inside, though, Marcus felt the weight of every stare, every whispered complaint. He wasn't blind to the inconvenience his presence caused, but he wouldn't yield. This was Sergeant Crowley's final journey, and Marcus had sworn to see it through with the dignity it demanded. His mind flickered to the letter taped to the casket's corner, hidden beneath the folds of the flag. The envelope, worn and creased, bore a mother's shaky handwriting. "Please bring my son home with honor." Those words had seared themselves into Marcus's soul when he'd first read them, a plea that carried the raw grief of a family shattered by loss. He could almost feel the mother's trembling hand as she wrote it, her desperation anchoring him to his duty as surely as his grip on the casket. Mallerie, undeterred, pressed her case. "No exceptions," she said, barely glancing at the official documentation Marcus produced from his breast pocket. "Rules exist for a reason. Move it, or I'll call additional security." Her voice was clipped, her patience thinning as the crowd's attention intensified. To her, this was a matter of protocol, a line in the sand drawn by years of enforcing airport regulations. She wasn't heartless, far from it. Mallerie had her own struggles, her own sleepless nights worrying about keeping the terminal running smoothly under relentless pressure. But rules were her lifeline, the framework that kept chaos at bay. A military procession, no matter how solemn, was a disruption she couldn't afford. The standoff drew a growing semicircle of onlookers. Some watched with idle curiosity, others with barely concealed frustration at the delay. A young mother pulled her son closer, whispering for him to look away, though her own eyes lingered on the casket with a mix of awe and unease. The boy, no older than 7, stared wide-eyed, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. Marcus felt their gazes like a physical weight, but he held his ground, his right hand steady on the casket handle. His oath was not to the airport nor to its rules, but to the man he escorted and the family awaiting him. To falter now would be to betray that promise. In the crowd, an elderly man in a faded windbreaker stood quietly at the back, unnoticed by most. His hand drifted to his heart, an instinctive gesture born of decades-old habits. He was a Vietnam veteran, though no one around him knew it. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes were fixed on the casket, on the flag, on the soldier who stood resolute. Memories of his own comrades, of promises kept and broken, flickered in his mind, stirring a quiet ache he'd long learned to bury. Other older passengers showed similar signs of recognition, subtle shifts in posture, a faint tightening of the jaw, hints of military bearing that set them apart. But they remained silent, caught between respect for Marcus's duty and the unspoken rules of civilian territory. The terminal's atmosphere grew taut, the air thick with unspoken questions. Why was this happening here, in the middle of a bustling airport? Who was this soldier, and why did his presence command such reverence? Then, as if in answer, a sharp crackle broke through the intercom, an urgent call that silenced the crowd. One by one, passengers stood, their hands rising in hesitant salutes, heads bowed, eyes fixed on the casket as Marcus resumed his slow, deliberate march. The shift was electric, a collective recognition of something greater than rules or schedules. But who had given the order, and what had changed to make an entire terminal pause in reverence? The answer lay somewhere in the moments that followed, in the unspoken bonds of honor and sacrifice that transcended the cave of the morning rush. The air in Dallas Airport's Terminal B crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. Marcus Reed stood rooted to the spot, his polished boots gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, his posture rigid as if carved from stone. The weight of his duty pressed against his chest, heavier than the ceremonial rifle resting on his shoulder. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a tomb guard, one of the rare few chosen to uphold a sacred vigil. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the unyielding resolve that coursed through him, a resolve forged in the crucible of tradition and sacrifice. Around him, the world seemed to blur, indifferent travelers, impatient murmurs, and the sharp, mocking laughter of a woman who didn't understand the gravity of what she was challenging. Mallerie, the terminal manager, stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly, her foot tapping in impatient rhythm against the polished floor. Her eyes burned with frustration, her lips pursed into a thin line. She wasn't a cruel woman, but her world was one of rules, schedules, and efficiency. To her, Marcus was a disruption, a stubborn obstacle in her tightly controlled domain. "I'm waiting," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the crowd. "Security protocols don't bend for anyone, not even the military. You don't get to waltz through my terminal like it's your personal parade ground." Her words dripped with condescension, and she didn't bother to hide it. She felt the weight of her authority, the power to enforce order in this chaotic hub of travelers. But beneath her steely exterior, a flicker of unease stirred. She sensed something in Marcus's unwavering stance, something that made her second-guess her approach, though she'd never admit it. Marcus's response came low and steady, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who had faced far worse than bureaucratic pushback. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said, his eyes locked on hers, "this soldier gave his life to protect his unit from an IED explosion. His final request was a tomb guard escort for his last journey. I cannot and will not abandon my post." His words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that silenced the nearby whispers for a moment. In his mind, he saw the handwritten letter from Jason Crowley's mother, her trembling hands pressing it into his palm just 3 days ago. Her voice, fragile but resolute, echoed in his memory. "He was my only child. Please don't let him travel alone." That promise was a chain binding Marcus to this moment, unbreakable as the oath he'd sworn as a tomb guard. To falter now would be to betray not just Jason, but every soldier who had ever stood for something greater than themselves. Mallerie let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh that echoed off the terminal walls. "Your post?" she scoffed, her tone laced with mockery. "This is Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, not Arlington Cemetery. Time for a reality check, soldier." Her words were meant to sting, to put Marcus in his place, but they only deepened the chasm between them. She felt the eyes of the growing crowd on her, their silent judgment feeding her resolve to stand firm. She wasn't about to let some ceremonial soldier derail her terminal's operations. Yet deep down, a small part of her wondered if she was pushing too far, if the man before her carried a burden she couldn't fully grasp. The crowd around them swelled, a ring of curious onlookers forming a loose circle. Some clutched their phones, filming the standoff as if it were a spectacle to be shared online. Others whispered among themselves, their voices a low hum of speculation and amusement. A group of college students snickered, one of them muttering, "This guy's holding up the whole airport for some parade nonsense." The words stung Marcus, though his face remained impassive, a mask of discipline honed through months of grueling training. He felt the weight of their indifference, their casual dismissal of the sacrifice he was honoring. But he stood alone, unyielding, the sole guardian of a fallen soldier's final wish in a sea of apathy and bureaucratic hostility. Marcus's mind drifted to his roots, to the small Texas town where he'd grown up, where military service wasn't just a job, it was a sacred calling. His grandfather had charged across Normandy Beach in 1944, carrying stories of valor that shaped Marcus's childhood. His father had returned from 2 tours in Vietnam, bearing invisible scars he never spoke of, yet carried with quiet dignity. When Marcus enlisted at 18, it wasn't for a paycheck or a career ladder. It was a fire in his blood, a legacy he couldn't ignore. Becoming a tomb guard, though, had demanded something more, a level of perfection that bordered on the inhuman. The selection process was a crucible, months of relentless physical conditioning, memorizing volumes of military history, and practicing ceremonial movements until they were as instinctive as his heartbeat. Of the hundreds who applied, fewer than 1 in 10 survived the cut. Those who did became soldiers of silence, guardians of Arlington's eternal vigil, bound by an oath to remain faithful, no matter the cost. Sergeant Jason Crowley had been just 24 when an IED tore through his convoy in Afghanistan. In his final moments, he'd thrown himself over 2 wounded comrades, shielding them with his own body. His last words, captured by a surviving teammate, were a testament to his courage. "If I don't make it home, only a tomb guard walks beside me on the last mile." Jason's mother, a widow living in a weathered farmhouse outside Dallas, had poured every penny she had into honoring her son's wish. 3 days ago, she'd met Marcus at the morgue, her eyes red from grief but fierce with determination. "He was my only child," she'd whispered, pressing Jason's letter into Marcus's hands. "Please don't let him travel alone." That moment had seared itself into Marcus's soul, a vow he'd carry until his duty was done. But here in the sterile chaos of the airport, that vow clashed with a world that didn't understand. Mallory's patience snapped. "I'm calling additional security," she announced, yanking her radio from her belt. We have a military situation that needs resolution. Her voice was firm, but there was a tremor in it, a crack in her confidence as she sensed the tide shifting. The crowd grew thicker, business travelers glancing at their watches with mounting irritation, their schedules disrupted by this stubborn soldier. The college students' laughter grew louder, one of them live streaming the scene with snarky commentary. Check out this guy thinking he's in some war movie. Marcus felt the weight of their gazes, their judgment, but he stood taller, his resolve unshaken. 3 more security guards approached, their hands resting on their utility belts. A subtle warning. The lead guard, Rodriguez, a retired police officer with graying hair and a weary expression, stepped forward. He'd seen enough conflict in his years to recognize the kind of man Marcus was, one who didn't bend, but his job demanded order, and Marcus was a disruption. Son, Rodriguez said, his voice heavy with professional fatigue. You need to move this to the cargo area. You're holding up terminal operations. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of authority, the expectation of compliance. Marcus met Rodriguez's gaze, his eyes steady and unyielding. Sir, he said, his voice calm but resolute, I have proper authorization for a ceremonial escort through passenger areas. This soldier died serving his country. His family requested full military honors. In his mind, he saw Jason's mother again, her trembling hands, her whispered plea. He thought of Jason, a young man who'd given everything to save his brothers in arms. Marcus's duty wasn't just to a fallen soldier. It was to a mother's grief, a family's sacrifice, a nation's promise. He would not falter. Then, cutting through the tension, the intercom crackled to life. All airport personnel and military veterans, please report to Terminal B for a moment of honor. The words hung in the air, a spark in the darkness. Marcus's heart lifted, a flicker of hope amidst the hostility. The tide was turning, and he stood ready to face whatever came next, a soldier of silence guarding his post. In the sterile chaos of the airport terminal, Marcus stood resolute, a solitary figure in his crisp military uniform, his white-gloved hands steady on the polished handle of the casket. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, not from the physical burden, but from the promise he'd made, a vow to a mother whose grief had carved hollows in her eyes. He could still hear her trembling voice, entrusting him to bring her son home with dignity. That promise anchored him, even as the crowd's disdain swirled around him like a bitter wind. A young woman with vibrant purple hair scoffed loudly, her voice slicing through the hum of the terminal. Full military honors? Seriously? This isn't some Hollywood war flick, soldier boy. It's an airport, for crying out loud. Her words sparked laughter, rippling through the onlookers like a contagion. The mockery felt like a physical shove, but Marcus didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed, not on the sneering faces or the impatient travelers, but on something distant, an unshakable sense of duty that kept him rooted. Nearby, a teenager edged closer, phone raised, his exaggerated salute mocking Marcus for the amusement of his online audience. Yo, check this out, guys. Military dude thinks he's in a parade or something. The kid's grin widened as likes and comments flooded his screen, each notification a small victory in his quest for clout. Marcus felt the sting of being reduced to a spectacle, but he held his ground, his jaw tight, his heart pounding with a quiet resolve. An older man in a tailored business suit pushed through the crowd, his impatience palpable. Some of us have actual jobs to get to, he barked, his tone dripping with condescension. Take your costume party somewhere else. The word costume landed like a slap, as if Marcus's uniform, pressed with care, worn with pride, was nothing more than a prop. Still, Marcus's expression remained unyielding, a mask of discipline hiding the turmoil within. He wanted to shout that this wasn't about him, that the casket held a life, a story, a sacrifice. But he stayed silent, honoring the fallen with his stillness. The cruelest blow came from an unexpected source. A middle-aged woman in scrubs, her face etched with exhaustion, shoved her way to the front. I work at the VA hospital, she declared, her voice sharp with authority. I see real PTSD every single day. This is just military theater for attention. This isn't some parade act. Grow up. Her words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. This was someone who should have understood. Someone who worked with veterans, who saw their scars, both visible and invisible. The accusation that his duty was a performance cracked something deep inside him, a fault line in his composure. Yet his face betrayed nothing, his eyes still locked on the horizon of his promise. In the shadows of the crowd, unnoticed by most, others watched with quieter eyes, their hearts heavy with recognition. Franks Morrison, 73, stood at the back end, his faded windbreaker concealing the Purple Heart pin he rarely showed anymore. Vietnam had been left him with scars and a quiet pride, but civilian spaces like this felt hostile, unsafe for the honor he'd once carried openly. He saw Marcus's rigid stance, the casket's solemn weight, and his chest ached with memories of comrades lost. He wanted to step forward, to stand beside the young soldier, but fear of becoming a target for himself kept him rooted. Maria Santos, 51, blended into the crowd in her civilian clothes, her 20-year Air Force career invisible to those around her. She recognized the sacred duty Marcus was upholding, the same duty she'd once performed with pride. But the crowd's hostility made her hesitate, her shoulders hunching slightly as she wrestled with the urge to speak up. She felt a pang of guilt, knowing she'd once stood as tall as Marcus, unafraid of judgment. Now the weight of civilian judgment pressed against her courage. David's Chen, 42, kept his Gulf War service pin tucked in his pocket, his fingers brushing against it nervously. He understood the mockery Marcus endured, having felt similar scorn when he'd worn his uniforms in public years ago. The airport felt like a minefield, where pride in service could detonate into ridicule. He watched Marcus with a mix of admiration and shame, his eyes glistening with tears as he realized he lacked the young soldier's resolve to stand firm. Speaking up might draw the crowd's venom at him, and he wasn't sure he could bear it. Rodriguez's, the lead security guard, approached Marcus with a reluctant sigh of reluctance. "Look, I respect your service, man," he said, his voice softer than the crowd. "But I've got a job to do here. These people have flights to catch, and you're causing a scene at pause." His tone was softer than the crowd's, but the words still grated on Marcus. He reached into his breast pocket, his movements deliberate and slow, and withdrew a small, worn badge. His Tomb Guard insignia, a cherished relic passed down from his fathers, who had served the same duty decades before him. Engraved on the back, in tiny little letters, were the words "Honor before comfort." He held it up, not as an act of defiance, but as a quiet testament to his purpose, a reminder that this wasn't about rules or convenience, but about a promise that transcended the bustle of this terminal. The intercom crackled again, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Final call. If you've ever served, your presence is requested at Terminal B." The words hung in the air like a summons, stirring something deep in the silent watchers who understood. Frank's hand twitched toward his hidden pin, a reflex born of duty long buried. Maria's shoulders squared, her posture straightening as if donning her old uniform once more. David's eyes glistened, a spark of resolve breaking through his fear of shame. The mockery continued, phones recording, voices jeering, but beneath it all, a quieter tide began to flow, a tide of recognition, of shared sacrifice, of honor stirring in the tension. The tension peaked when Mallory's, the terminal manager in charge, decided to assert her authority. "Remove him," she ordered, her security team, her voice cold and unyielding. "If he's not willing to comply with airport protocol voluntarily, we'll have escort him and his cargo out to the appropriate area." Rodriguez hesitated, his gut twisting at the thought of laying hands on Marcus's. Something about the young soldier's unwavering dignity, the way he carried himself, made the order feel deeply wrong, like a violation of something sacred. But Mallory's sharp voice cut through his doubt like a knife. "Now, Rodriguez's, this isn't some request." Rodriguez stepped forward, reluctantly, his hands extended toward the casket's handle. "Son, I need you to step away from this." "Don't touch it," Marcus's voice said quietly, his voice low but laced with a quiet intensity that stopped Rodriguez cold. It was the first time he'd shown any emotion, a crack in his stoic facade, a glimpse of raw vulnerability beneath his polished exterior. His grip tightened on the casket, almost imperceptibly, but his posture remained impeccable. a soldier's bearing unbroken despite everything. The crowd sensed the escalation, the tension building like a storm about to break, and more phones swiveled to capture it. Livestream viewer counts surged, links spreading like wildfire across platforms as the scene unfolded. Marcus stood firm and resolute, his vigil unbroken, a beacon in the storm of scorn. The promise he'd made to a grieving mother burned brighter than the crowd's disdain, guiding him through the chaos of humiliation. In the distance, the intercom's call lingered in the hearts of those who understood its weight, a reminder that honor, though mocked, could still endure in the quiet moments of unwavering courage. The airport terminal hummed with the restless energy of travelers, suitcases clattering, footsteps echoing, and impatience simmering in the air. Private First Class Marcus Reed stood unwavering, his body a pillar of discipline amidst the chaos. At 27, he carried the weight of his duty like a mantle, his eyes locked on a distant point, guarding the casket of Sergeant Jason Crowley. The coffin's polished wood gleamed under the terminal's harsh lights, a silent monument to a life lost too soon. Marcus's uniform was immaculate, his movements precise, but beneath his stoic exterior, a storm of emotions raged, pride in his purpose, grief for a fallen comrade, and a creeping sense of betrayal as the crowd around him grew hostile. The terminal was a cauldron of judgment. Whispers turned to sneers, sharp and biting. Military privilege at its finest, a businesswoman snapped, her voice thick with contempt as she tapped her foot, her flight delayed by Marcus's refusal to step aside. Nearby, a group of teenagers, fueled by the crowd's frustration, began chanting, "Move it, move it, move it." Their voices carried the cadence of a cruel game, transforming a moment of solemnity into a public spectacle. Phones raised, they recorded every second, their laughter slicing through Marcus like shrapnel. He absorbed every jeer, every mocking chuckle, his face a mask of professional calm. But inside, something was splintering. He wasn't just guarding a hero who died shielding others. He was watching his country turn its back on that sacrifice. The realization pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating. A healthcare worker, her badge catching the light, shook her head in disgust. "This is why people lose respect for the military," she declared, her voice carrying to those around her. "It's all arrogance and attention-seeking." Her words were a dagger, each one piercing Marcus's heart. He wanted to shout that this wasn't about him, that he stood here for Sergeant Crowley, a 24-year-old who gave his life to save his squad from an IED. But his oath held him silent, his body rooted to the spot, bound by honor. The crowd's gaze felt like a physical weight, their judgment a fog that threatened to choke him. Mallerie, the airport security supervisor, stepped forward, her authority crackling like static. "Last chance, soldier boy," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Move your little parade, or we'll move it for you." The challenge hung in the air, daring Marcus to waver. He met her eyes, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "With respect, ma'am," he said, each word carefully measured. "I swore an oath. I cannot leave my post. I cannot abandon Sergeant Crowley." His voice trembled only faintly, betraying the pride, grief, and despair warring inside him. Mallory's laugh was sharp and cruel, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your oath?" she scoffed. "To who? Some dead guy who probably shouldn't have been there in the first place?" Her words lingered, acrid and heavy, like smoke. A few in the crowd flinched, their faces betraying unease, but no one spoke up. Among them were veterans, Frank, Maria, David, each carrying the weight of their own service. Frank, a Vietnam vet with calloused hands and a heart scarred by war, felt shame ignite in his chest. He wanted to defend Marcus, to shout that this young man was honoring a promise they all understood. But the crowd's hostility paralyzed him, old wounds and public scorn anchoring him in place. Maria, who had served in Iraq, clenched her fists, her mind flashing to the friends she'd lost and the vows she'd made to honor them. David, a Gulf War veteran, stared at the floor, his silence a quiet betrayal of the pride he once carried. Then, a voice thundered across the terminal, commanding and unyielding. "Stand down, all of you." The crowd turned, their murmurs falling silent, as a tall man in his 70s strode toward them with purpose. Colonel David Monroe, His formal military dress uniform, adorned with ribbons and medals, moved with the confidence of a man who had faced far greater battles. His uniform was pristine, each ribbon a testament to a life of service. Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. His arthritis made each step a private struggle, but his bearing was that of a warrior, proud and unbreakable. The crowd parted instinctively, their phones lowering as they sensed a presence greater than their frustration. Monroe ignored the security guards, ignored Mallory's protests, and stopped 3 feet from Marcus. Despite his age, despite the pain in his joints, despite the hundreds of watching eyes, he snapped to attention with a precision born of decades of discipline. His salute was crisp, a gesture of respect that carried the weight of a lifetime in uniform. "Private First Class Reed," he said, his voice resonating in the now silent terminal. "It is an honor to meet a tomb guard in the performance of his duty." Marcus returned the salute, his throat tightening as tears welled in his eyes. For the first time that day, he felt seen, not as a spectacle, but as a soldier honoring a sacred promise. Monroe turned to the crowd, his command voice filling Terminal B. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words steady and deliberate, "you are witnessing something that should make every American proud. This young man has volunteered for one of the most demanding duties in our military, to ensure that no fallen soldier travels his final mile alone." The teenager who had been chanting froze, his phone still recording, but his mocking smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of shame. Monroe continued, his voice unwavering. Sergeant Jason Crowley was 24 years old. He died protecting his fellow soldiers from an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan. His final request was for a tomb guard to escort him home to his mother. Private Reed volunteered for that duty, knowing it would mean standing vigil, no matter the cost, to his own comfort or yours. Mallory stepped forward, her face flushed with defiance. "Sir, with respect, we have protocols." Monroe's gaze settled on her, heavy with the authority of decades of leadership. "Ma'am," he interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding, "what you're witnessing is not a disruption. This is what America looks like at its best. This is honor. This is duty. This is love of country made visible." His words struck like a gavel, silencing her protests and stirring the crowd. Faces softened, eyes dropped, and the air shifted. Frank Morrison, the Vietnam veteran, felt a spark ignite in his chest. The shame that had held him back melted away, replaced by a surge of pride. He stepped forward, his old knees creaking, and stood beside Marcus, his presence a quiet declaration of solidarity. Maria followed, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and David, too, found the courage to move. The crowd began to transform, their anger giving way to reflection. The healthcare worker, who had spoken earlier, looked away, her cheeks flushed with regret. The teenagers lowered their phones, their chance forgotten. In that moment, the terminal became a place of reverence, a reminder of the sacrifices that bind a nation together, even when it forgets. In the bustling chaos of Dallas Airport's Terminal B, a solemn scene unfolded, one that would ripple through the hearts of everyone present. A young soldier, Marcus Crowley, lay in a flag-draped casket, escorted by a lone honor guard who stood resolute, his face etched with quiet determination. The terminal was alive with the usual clamor, rushed travelers, impatient voices, and the hum of rolling suitcases. But for one man, an elderly veteran named Monroe, the sight of that casket stirred something deep within. His hands trembled as he reached into the worn pocket of his jacket, pulling out a Purple Heart pin, its edges softened by years of careful handling. He pinned it over his chest, the weight of memory pressing against his heart. "I served with the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam," he declared, his voice steady but thick with emotion. The words carried a quiet power, cutting through the noise. "This young man," he said, gesturing toward the casket, "represents everything we fought for. Freedom, sacrifice, a promise to protect what matters most." His eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with the fierce pride of a man who had carried the weight of war and survived to tell its truth. Maria Santos, a woman with a spine of steel, forged at over 20 years in the Air Force, stepped forward next. Her voice rang out, clear and unwavering, though her throat tightened with the grief she'd long learned to carry. "I've escorted fallen soldiers home," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "This isn't just a duty, It's sacred. It's a vow we make to those who gave everything. Her words were a blade, sharp and true, slicing through the indifference that had hung in the air moments before. She stood tall, her uniform long retired, but her resolve as unyielding as ever, her heart heavy with the memory of every flag-draped coffin she'd accompanied, each one a story of loss and honor. From the edge of the crowd, David Chen emerged, his face streaked with tears that he made no effort to hide. A Gulf War veteran, his shoulders bore the invisible scars of battles fought decades ago. His voice cracked as he spoke, each word a confession wrenched from a place of deep regret. "I should have spoken up sooner," he said, his eyes fixed on the casket. "I'm sorry, soldier." The apology was raw, a wound laid bare. David's hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing with memories of comrades lost, of moments when he'd stayed silent in the face of disrespect. This time, he wouldn't let the moment pass. His tears were not just for Marcus, but for every soldier whose sacrifice had been overlooked, for every veteran who'd felt invisible in a world that moved on without them. One by one, others stepped forward, their voices weaving a tapestry of service and sacrifice. Men and women, young and old, from every corner of the nation's history, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, stood shoulder to shoulder, their differences erased by the shared bond of duty. The crowd, which had been jeering and dismissive moments before, fell silent, their mockery replaced by a stunned reverence. The terminal employee who had scoffed at Marcus's solemn procession now stood hatless, his face flushed with the dawning realization of his error. A healthcare worker, who had earlier dismissed the scene as a bid for attention, pressed her hand to her mouth, shame pulling in her chest as she watched the veterans form a corridor of respect around the casket. Even the teenagers who had been filming the scene with cruel amusement lowered their phones, their laughter dying as they grasped the gravity of their actions. They hadn't just been recording the moment of own, they'd been documenting their own thoughtlessness. A small girl, no older than 6, tugged at her mother's sleeve, her wide eyes scanning the silent crowd. "Mommy, why is everyone so quiet now?" she whispered, her voice a soft note in the stillness. Her mother knelt down, tears brimming in her eyes as she met her daughter's gaze. "Because someone who loved our country is going home, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And we almost forgot to say thank you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a nation's gratitude, a reminder of the debt owed to those who give everything. The girl nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the reverence that had transformed the terminal. Monroe, his face lined with the wisdom of years and the pain of loss, approached the casket. From his jacket, he withdrew a bronze star, earned in the jungles of Vietnam 40 years prior. His hands, steady now, placed the medal beside the flag, a quiet offering from one generation to the next. "Every generation must honor the last," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but resonant with conviction. "That's how a nation survives." The words hung in the air, a call to remembrance, a plea for unity in a world too quick to forget. For 2 full minutes, the terminal stood still. Hundreds of strangers, united by nothing more than their shared humanity, stood in silent respect for a soldier they'd never known. The only sounds were the soft sobs of those moved to tears and the distant hum of aircraft engines, a reminder of the world continuing beyond this sacred pause. Guided by Monroe's quiet leadership and the young guard's unwavering resolve, Terminal B had become a sanctuary of honor, a moment that would echo through Dallas Airport's history. In the hours that followed, the airport's management issued a public apology to Sergeant Crowley's family, their words heavy with regret for the disrespect shown. They announced the immediate installation of a memorial plaque at Gate B-17, its bronze inscription a permanent testament, the last salute in honor of all who serve and those who escort them home. Mallerie Stevens, the terminal employee whose mockery had sparked the initial discord, was shaken to her core. That evening, she submitted her resignation, her letter a raw confession. "I failed to recognize honor when it stood directly in front of me. The military families who passed through this airport deserve better leadership than I provided." But the airport's board saw a different path. Instead of accepting her resignation, they enrolled Mallerie in a comprehensive honor training program, crafted by veteran organizations to teach the weight of military traditions, the significance of ceremonial duties, and the stories of sacrifice behind every folded flag. Marcus, the young guard who had stood steadfast by the casket, was invited to speak at the program's inaugural session. Standing before airport staff, security personnel, and managers, he spoke with a quiet strength that belied his years. "We are not guardians of the dead," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "We are keepers of promises made to the living. Every time we honor a fallen soldier, we honor the families they left behind and the country they died protecting." His words struck like a bell, clear and resonant, sparking an immediate response. Letters flooded the airport from across the country, veterans sharing stories of being dismissed in civilian spaces, families of fallen soldiers expressing gratitude for those fighting to preserve dignity in death. Colonel Monroe became a fixture at Dallas Airport, his presence a quiet reassurance to military families passing through. He greeted them personally, ensuring they felt the respect they deserved. His Bronze Star remained with Sergeant Crowley's casket throughout its journey home, a symbol of the unbroken thread connecting generations of service. The veterans who had found their voices that day in Terminal B carried their newfound courage forward, their stories no longer hidden but shared, a testament to the power of honor reclaimed. In the quiet hum of Terminal B, a small group of strangers found themselves woven into an unlikely tapestry of support, bound by a shared reverence for sacrifice. Frank Morrison, Maria Santos, and David Chen, each carrying their own burdens and histories, began meeting monthly at the airport's newly opened Veterans Lounge, a sanctuary carved out for military families navigating the chaos of travel. They dubbed themselves the Terminal B7, a nod to the 7 veterans who on that pivotal morning had stood together in quiet solidarity. For them, the lounge wasn't just a place to sit, it was a refuge where their stories of loss, pride, and unspoken grief could unfold without judgment. Frank, a retired mechanic who'd served in Vietnam, often stared out the lounge's window, his weathered hands trembling as he spoke of comrades left behind. Maria, whose brother never returned from Iraq, clung to the group as a lifeline, her laughter masking a sorrow that lingered like a shadow. David, younger but no less haunted, found solace in their shared silence, his eyes often tracing the memorial plaque at Gate B-17 as he wrestled with memories of his own deployments. The little girl who had once pierced the airport's heavy silence with her innocent question, "Why was everyone so quiet?" became a beacon of purity in their midst. Her mother, Jennifer Walsh, felt a quiet pride swell in her chest each time she brought her daughter to the airport's monthly honor ceremonies. These brief rituals, designed to recognize military families passing through, became sacred to Jennifer. She watched her daughter, no older than 7, carefully place tiny American flags beside the memorial plaque, her small hands steady with purpose. For the girl, it was a ritual born of curiosity, but for Jennifer, it was a lesson in reverence, a way to teach her daughter that some moments demand pause. Over time, this simple act wove itself into the airport's culture, a quiet tradition that travelers began to anticipate, their own hurried steps slowing as they passed the plaque. The teenagers who had once mocked Marcus Reed, their laughter sharp and careless, found themselves transformed by the weight of their own actions. Their video, originally meant to ridicule, spiraled into something far greater. It spread across the internet, not as a joke, but as a testament to respect reborn. Comments poured in, stories of soldiers lost, of families left to carry their memory, of strangers moved to tears by the sight of a community pausing to honor the fallen. Ashley Martinez, one of the teens, felt a knot of shame loosen into something like redemption. She poured her regret into an essay, her words raw and unflinching, as she described the moment she realized her mockery had dishonored not just Marcus, but every soldier he represented. The essay, submitted for a school competition, earned her a citizenship award. But more than that, it gave her a new lens on the world, one where respect wasn't just a word, but a debt owed to those who served. The healthcare worker, who had once dismissed Marcus's solemn duty as mere military theater, was haunted by her own callousness. She couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing resolute, his uniform crisp, his eyes fixed on a purpose she hadn't understood. Driven by a need to atone, she requested a transfer to work solely with veteran patients. Her evenings, once spent unwinding at home, were now given to volunteering at the VA hospital. There, she listened to the stories behind the uniforms, tales of courage, loss, and quiet resilience that reshaped her understanding of service. Each conversation chipped away at her old assumptions, replacing them with a deep respect that felt both humbling and urgent. 6 months after that pivotal morning, Terminal B became a blueprint for airports across the nation. The Dallas Protocol, as it came to be known, set a new standard: specific procedures for honoring military escorts, designated spaces for ceremonial duties, and mandatory respect training for every staff member. Ruth Crowley, the mother of Sergeant Jason Crowley, whose memory had sparked this change, became a cornerstone of these trainings. Her voice, steady despite the grief that never fully left her, carried the weight of a mother's love and loss. She ended every session with the same words, delivered with quiet conviction. "My son died believing in something greater than himself. When you honor his escort, you honor that belief. When you dismiss it, you tell every soldier their sacrifice doesn't matter." Her words lingered in the air, a challenge to those who heard them to choose dignity over indifference. For Marcus Reed, the experience at Terminal B left an indelible mark. As a tomb guard, he'd always carried his duty with pride, but now he carried something more: a business card from Colonel Monroe, tucked into his wallet like a talisman. The card, creased from months of handling, reminded him that honor transcends rank or age, that it's a language spoken by those who understand sacrifice. The memorial plaque at Gate B-17 became a sacred site, a place where military families and strangers alike left fresh flowers daily. Each bloom was a quiet acknowledgement that some duties outweigh the rush of civilian life, that some moments demand reverence over routine. A year later, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the National Memorial Day ceremony in Washington, D.C. Beside him sat Colonel Monroe, now 84, his movements slower but his gaze as sharp as ever, still capable of spotting disrespect from a distance. Marcus's voice, steady and resonant, filled the room. "Standing in silence, removing your hat, placing your hand over your heart. These are the simplest ways to honor someone who fell protecting what you cherish. No training required, no special knowledge needed, just the recognition that some sacrifices deserve acknowledgement." The audience, veterans, families, civilians, and politicians, listened with a stillness born of shared loss, their hearts heavy with the weight of his words. Colonel Monroe took the microphone next, his weathered hands steady despite the years. "Honor is not outdated," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a life spent in service. "It is not optional. Each generation stands strong only when it learns to bow its head before those who came before." His words, simple yet profound, echoed through the auditorium, a reminder that respect is a choice, one that binds the living to the fallen. The video from Terminal B had grown into something far greater than a fleeting viral moment. It became a teaching tool, shown in classrooms across America to spark discussions about duty, respect, and the difference between following rules and doing what's right. The footage captured a singular moment when a community chose honor over convenience, dignity over efficiency. Its impact rippled far beyond the airport, becoming a shorthand for recognizing when systems failed to honor those who serve. Military families began sharing their own stories, moments when bureaucracy had trampled on the sacred, when indifference had overshadowed sacrifice. Each story was a call to action, a reminder that honor, once recognized, could reshape the world. Mallerie Stevens, now the director of the nation's pioneering Veteran Family Services program at Dallas International Airport, carried a weight of hard-earned wisdom. Her journey to this role had been marked by a profound shift in perspective, one she often shared with new staff during their onboarding. She'd sit there now and then, her voice steady but laced with the quiet intensity of someone who'd seen truth up close. "Authority without empathy is just hollow noise," she'd say, her eyes searching theirs for understanding. Years ago, a young man escorting a fallen soldier's casket passed through our terminal. He wasn't causing a disturbance. He was revealing what this place could be: a sanctuary where honor outweighs the rush of schedules, where we pause to recognize what truly matters. Mallory's transformation hadn't come easily. She'd once been consumed by the airport's relentless pace, gates to manage, flights to coordinate, complaints to diffuse. But that day, watching the young man's quiet dignity as he moved through the chaos, something in her broke open. She felt a pang of shame for her initial irritation, followed by a surge of awe. Now, every decision she made as director was guided by that moment, a commitment to ensure the airport wasn't just a transit hub, but a place where humanity could shine through, even amid the clamor. Jennifer Walsh's daughter, now 7 years old, stood with a solemnity far beyond her years as she recited the Pledge of Allegiance. Her small voice carried a conviction that seemed to anchor everyone around her. The words weren't just memorized, they held meaning, as if she'd absorbed their weight through the stories her mother shared about sacrifice and service. Every weekend, she visited the airport's memorial, a tiny figure clutching a bundle of American flags. But now she didn't come alone. She brought her classmates, their chatter falling silent as she showed them how to place the flags just so, each one a tribute to someone who'd served. Respect isn't something you're born with, she'd tell them, echoing her mother's words with a seriousness that made adults pause. It's something you do. For Jennifer, watching her daughter lead these quiet rituals was both heartwarming and heart-rending. She saw the spark of purpose in her child's eyes, but it came at the cost of a childhood innocence lost too soon. Yet, Jennifer wouldn't change it. She believed her daughter's actions were weaving a thread of compassion into the next generation, ensuring the sacrifices of those honored at the memorial wouldn't fade into oblivion. Ruth Crowley, the mother of Sergeant Jason, had spent years grappling with a grief that threatened to swallow her whole. Losing her son had left a void no words could fill, but over time, she'd carved out a purpose from that pain. Her monthly visits to Terminal B were more than a pilgrimage to mourn. They were a mission to keep Jason's legacy alive. Standing by the bronze plaque at Gate B7, she'd watch travelers pause, some removing their hats, others standing in quiet respect as military families passed through. Each gesture, no matter how small, felt like a whisper from her son, telling her his death hadn't been in vain. When people stop and honor the living and the fallen, she'd say, her voice thick with emotion, Jason's sacrifice becomes more than a tragedy. It becomes a beacon of hope. Ruth's heart swelled with bittersweet pride as she saw the wall of service grow. What began with a single plaque had expanded into a tapestry of photographs and stories, each one a testament to local military families. She'd spend hours ensuring every detail was perfect, from the polished frames to the updated biographies. For Ruth, this wall wasn't just a memorial. It was a living reminder that those in uniform were neighbors, friends, and family, not distant figures in a newsreel. Marcus, the Arlington National Cemetery Honor Guard, carried out his duties with the same precision as always, but something had shifted deep within him. His encounter with Ruth Crowley years ago had planted a seed that grew into a quiet revelation. Civilian spaces could hold the same sanctity as the hallowed grounds of Arlington, if people chose to make them so. The promise he'd made to Ruth, to ensure her son's sacrifice was never forgotten, had evolved into a broader vow. He now saw every act of service, no matter how small, as deserving of recognition. Whether it was a soldier's quiet return home or a family's private farewell, Marcus felt a duty to ensure those moments were met with reverence. His time at the airport had changed him, buffeting the edges of his stoic demeanor. He'd catch himself pausing at Gate B7 during layovers, his gaze lingering on the wall of service. The faces in those photographs weren't strangers. They were part of a community he'd sworn to honor. Marcus carried this sense of purpose like a talisman, a reminder that even in the bustle of everyday life, there was room for something sacred. Every Memorial Day, Terminal B transformed into a place of profound stillness. For 2 minutes, the entire concourse paused. Flights were held, conversations hushed, and the usual frenzy of travel gave way to a shared act of remembrance. The national anthem played softly over the intercom, its notes weaving through the crowd like a gentle thread. Hundreds of strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, their differences forgotten in the face of a shared understanding. Some moments demand more than efficiency, they demand reverence. Travelers, airport staff, and military families alike joined in this unspoken pact, their silence a powerful tribute to those who'd served. For Mallerie, it was a moment of quiet triumph, proof that her vision for the airport was taking root. For Jennifer's daughter, it was a chance to feel the weight of her small actions ripple outward. For Ruth, it was a balm for her aching heart, a sign that Jason's spirit endured. And for Marcus, it was a reminder that his promise to Ruth was being fulfilled, not just by him, but by an entire community. This tradition, unbroken since its inception, stood as a testament to the power of collective honor, a fleeting but unshakable pause in a world that rarely slowed down.